In my second year of the bishop weed control experiment, I have many more plots which I will be using to test my control methods. The number of plots will allow me to test only one variable at a time instead of last year's where I had two variables changing between the two plots, time and method of cutting. Here I will be maintaining the amount of time on these plots, about weekly, maybe every other week. It is the more frequent one, depending on when I'm able to do it. As this plot I will be cutting with the string trimmer, and this plot I'll be cutting with the scythe. These two plots I actually am going to be leaving kind of as is, because in setting up this experiment today, I realized that they don't have enough gout weed as similar as the other plots are. These two plots, I'll be doing the less frequent, maybe every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, control with a string trimmer and the scythe. Back here, I will be scything at kind of a control level of, I don't know, once a month, maybe even less than that. Kind of the intent of this is, if this is the plot where I'm kind of saying, I could reasonably treat a large percentage of our land to this level if I chose to. Is that going to do anything? And then off on the side, I'll be maintaining as a control. My intention is to see if I can control the bishop weed, also known as gout weed, which is an invasive, and in the field it is able to mix in with the type of kind of grass and other sedges vegetation, but in some of the woods nearby it's really taken over and killed off all the wildflowers that we used to see in those woods. I'm also going to be continuing this at the same schedules and type of treatment I did for last year, which what I'm seeing with that is quite encouraging, with grass growing up rather well in the treated plot. Now July 9th, and 5 days after I last cut all these plots that you're going to be seeing me looking at today, I see some potential conclusions. These are the weekly plots, the ones that I cut weekly, and while I'm not seeing much of a difference between the gout weed growth on these, between what I do with the weed whacker and what I do with the scythe, I think I see some slightly better grass growth with the scythe plot than the weed whacker plot. I'm not certain of this, and it's less obvious now than earlier on, where I saw it a little bit more conclusively. Though I don't know for certain that this is even happening. If it is, my guess is that somehow how the weed whacker cuts it, which is a very jagged edge, versus the scythe, which is a much cleaner cut edge, means that the grass can grow back better from that clean cut edge than the jagged edge cut. And well, it's not growing from that edge because grass grows from down low right around ground level, but something to do with how the grass can seal after, just grows back when that sort of edge occurs. With the plots I'm cutting bi-weekly, the grass seems to maybe be growing better than the grass in the weekly plots, but so are the gout weed. I think that seems to be slightly better in general, with kind of more grass, the grass is outcompeting the gout weed slightly, but it's hard to tell between the two of them. It also makes it a little bit harder to tell because in the weekly plot, when I'm scything, I think I can get down to about the same level as as with the weed whacker, whereas in this bi-weekly plot, I have more difficulty scything down to the same level just because the grass is a little bit taller and it's just harder to get that even low level cut. But all of these are just kind of minor observations I can't fully confirm by any means, not even slightly confirm. Getting into the plot that I'm cutting, in this case it was 5 weeks, but occasionally through the summer, right now it seems to be very little gout weed growing up, but also very little grass. And it seems to me that what I see in our field is that when they cut our field, it doesn't grow back particularly fast at the start. And that's just, I think, due to this grass having actually very little like green parts down low, whereas like a long grass or a frequently cut grass has more green stuff, and that's allow the chlorophyll to give it energy and grow back down low. And it's also just that the grass is used to a low cut, and so it's adapted to growing at that lower cut. While after the first cut, before I did the second cut of it, it didn't seem to be too much difference between the kind of control plot. The one thing I did notice between this and the control plot is while the control plot had a lot of the goutweed flowers coming up, this plot didn't have any of the flowering goutweed. So this occasional may not really affect the amount of growth of goutweed, but it may reduce the flowering or eliminate the flowering, which would mean that it can't spread by seed, even though it could still spread by like root growing and that sort of stuff. It's August 22nd, and this is the plot I started cutting last year. Over here is what I've been doing almost weekly with the weed whacker string trimmer, and over here is what I've been doing about bi-weekly with the scythe. Half as often as this plot. Both of these look to be primarily grass. There's some of the goutweed coming up, but what's really dominant is grass, which kind of shows that my idea is working. Except you'll notice over here, this is all mostly dead, as well as out in front here. In this time since I last did the filming, we've had a very wet month and a half. Just the ground at some points has just been totally soggy, and this area had some standing water in it, which appears to have killed off most everything. There's a couple grasses growing through, and the sedges here, which are a wetland plant and really like wet conditions. And so the goutweed, kind of my impression is that it even does less well in these super wet conditions than the grasses. So just kind of where I see, like, there's no goutweed down here, but there are some grasses. Up here, there's a little bit more grasses. So I just find that I maybe don't have the best experiment because some conditions became extremely abnormally wet. But I don't know if that's the case or with what this cutting is keeping the goutweed down to being very minimal with the grass dominating. One of the things I'll touch on later is one of the issues I'm having with this experiment is that I'm using pretty small plot sizes. One of those potential issues is kind of edge effects. Like, I have like full tall stuff that maybe I've cut down once last summer, but I don't think I've cut it down this summer. I've kind of knocked it back, but that's falling into these plot areas, which maybe isn't the best thing for trying to judge what's happening if I was to cut a large area as opposed to a small plot. Over at the site I started this year, these are the plots I've been cutting bi-weekly and occasionally. This one was last cut 7 weeks ago, and these ones last cut 2 weeks ago. What you'll notice if you take a close look is that there really isn't much of the goutweed coming up on these that I've been either using the weed whacker, string trimmer, or scything. But there also isn't much grass. It seems to be that some sort of like ground covery thing. I've seen it around for years. I don't particularly think it's invasive, but I don't know what it's called. Has been mostly taking over and mostly outcompeting the goutweed and also the grass. Both are still present to some degree. I'm not really seeing much of a difference between what's cut with the string trimmer and what's cut with the scythe. And I also see a real lack of difference over at the sites that I've been cutting weekly. Those between the two types of cutting look almost identical. Over on those ones, this ground cover, though there's some of them still present, is not dominating such as it is over here. And the gout weed and the grass are both more prevalent in that area in, I'd say, about equal margins. This kind of ground cover having its effect as it does is like differently. I'm not necessarily sure is due to the timing because, well, it could be some difference in the timing. These different control plots, which have both had the same treatment, are vastly different types of grasses coming up, even though I laid these plots out last fall in an attempt to get an idea of that they would be the same between the plots, which, along with having to build these new ones, shows that that's clearly not the case. There is quite a lot of differences. That's one of the issues I have with this experiment, having only really like one plot of each type, where I should have at least 3 of each type to get an idea of if it's just like randomness or like difference in the grasses or just other randomness, or that there's some pattern. I just don't have that because I don't have the time, nor do I have the space that I feel is even marginally consistent between them. As I mentioned earlier, one of the issues I have with these is that these are small plots. As I scythe them, I'm not getting the long stroke that I would typically get in another cutting, such as like out here where I can get a really good stroke. Back in these, both what I've been cutting bi-weekly or weekly, as well as this occasional. The occasional works a little bit better because it's taller grass and that's more typical of scything, but these strokes are just so much shorter than the long strokes if I'm cutting a large area. And I don't know if that really has much of a effect in terms of how these small plots would really indicate a behavior if I was doing this over a large area, which I would likely be scything, not seeing much of a difference between the scythe and the weed whacker. Though the ground has dried out significantly since my last filming, it is now October 9th, I'm seeing broadly similar trends in these plots. There's a mix of grass and ground cover, and though there's less gout weed, I wonder if that's just because I'm getting near the end of the growing season. The real kind of test for these is looking at what happens at the beginning of next spring. Between these plots and the plot I started last year, the amount of gout weed looks similar, which is very little, but that other plot has a broader mix of different plants that are growing up than this plot. But I believe that could well just be it's in a different area that has a more diversity of plants than this area to start with.